Several other places. I was trying to sort of wrestle with when I was at Gordon Conwell whether I was going to go on for doctoral studies or what the heck I was going to do with an MA, and because I had switched from the MDiv to the MA. I never had any aspirations for doing ministerial work, but it was mostly kind of to find my own theology, but also because my wife at the time just thought that school, among one or two others, and by the way, Dallas Theological was on the list as well, would be a possible option. And so it was really, oddly enough, both exploratory and also preparatory in terms of like, what am I going to do next? Because I never thought it would be terminal degree, but what I was going to do with a master's degree. Some of the people I was working with at the University of Houston wanted me to go directly into a history department in a PhD program, and I knew that emotionally, intellectually, mentally, I was just not ready to go immediately or directly. I'm definitely glad I didn't do that as well. Yeah, so, but it's a longer story in terms of like the other transition. What was it like to move from that evangelical environment to a place like Harvard and so on?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Emily Cruz. I'm the Assistant Director of the Marty Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's, the correct time of day's conversation with Samuel Perry and Curtis Evans. Before I do that and announce or give their bios, I would love to just give you a little bit of info about the Marty Center and also about some of our upcoming events. The Marty Center is part of the UChicago Divinity School, housed right here in Swift Hall. We build on the Divinity School's long-standing conviction that the best and most innovative scholarship in religion arises from sustained dialogue with the world beyond the academy. We contribute to this dialogue by offering scholarly perspectives on the religious questions facing the wider public, while providing faculty and students the tools and opportunities to situate their scholarly questions within a broader cultural frame of reference. We also have programs and events, such as tonight's, and I would like to just give you a little bit of information about a few of those that are coming up. At the end of this month, on March 30th, we're going to host Samira Ahmed, Hyde Park author and UChicago alum, to discuss her book Amira and Hamza, The War to Save the World. She'll be in conversation with Zinat Rahman, the executive director of the Institute of Politics. Samira's event is part of our monthly Author Talks series, a collaboration with the Seminary Co-op Bookstore that brings authors of new books about religion or that touch on religion in some interesting and new way to discuss their work with members of the Div School or the university community. On April 20th and 21st, we'll host an interdisciplinary conference that brings together scholars, journalists, activists, and religious practitioners to discuss the future of religion and reproductive politics in the United States. And on April 25th, we'll host Divinity School visiting scholar Peter Harrison and novelist Marilyn Robinson for a discussion about the relationship between religion and science. You can find more information about all these events on our website, martycenter.org, and in our monthly newsletter, which you can sign up for at our website, martycenter.org. Now it is my pleasure to awkwardly hold this paper while I introduce you to our two guests for this afternoon. Samuel L. Perry is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Oklahoma. He received his PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago in 2015. Nice shout out there. Where he was also a Martin Marty Fellow in the Divinity School. An award-winning scholar and teacher, Dr. Perry is among the nation's leading experts on conservative Christianity and American politics, race, sexuality, and families. Dr. Perry is also the author of 4 books, most recently the award-winning Taking America Back for God with Andrew Whitehead and The Flag and the Cross with Philip Gorski, both of which we will discuss tonight. He is currently finishing his latest book entitled Religion for Realists: Why We All Need the Scientific Study of Religion Now More Than Ever. Professor Curtis Evans is Associate Professor of Religions in the Americas and the History of Christianity at the Divinity School. He is a historian of American religions with teaching and research interests in modern American religion, race and religion in the U.S. history, and slavery and Christianity. His research emphases are interpretations and cultural images of African American religion, examinations of religion as a force for and obstacle to social and political reform, and the question of how social problems become defined and addressed as moral problems at particular historical moments. His first book, The Burden of Black Religion, was a historical analysis of debates about the role of religion in the lives of African Americans and the origins of the scholarly category of the Black church. His second book, A Theology of Brotherhood, The Federal Council of Churches and the Problem of Race, forthcoming from NYU Press, explores the FCC's attempt at social and racial change from the 1920s to the 1940s, the evolution of theological reflections on race, and the circumstances that shape historical actors as they wrestle with the constraints of their social worlds. Please join me in welcoming Sam and Curtis.
Awkwardly place this microphone here. Or I will lay it there and let one of you first.
Does it work? Okay. Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? So, Sam, thank you for joining us. Really looking forward to this conversation. One of the things that is interesting about your own research is that you've done a lot of scholarship on white evangelical Protestants in the 20th and 21st century. Your first book looks at the orphan care movement. You look at adoption. You've looked at conservative Protestants and their struggles with pornography. And your two most recent books look at Christian nationalism, though not exclusively about white evangelical Protestantism. Still, they figure prominently. And so I'd be curious to hear a bit more about, like, how did you come to these topics as areas of research interest and how your research has evolved over time?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is I think we often, sociologists included, study things that are relevant to us personally. And so my own background growing up in an evangelical family, having gone to an evangelical seminary, and my first book was on evangelicals and adoption, and I also come from an adoptive family with growing up with two African American sisters, and so I was fascinated, and I have been fascinated, and I have always been fascinated, but I think growing up in an interracial evangelical family gave me something of a proto-sociological eye, always asking questions about race, always asking questions about the role of faith in the construction of families. My parents were largely apolitical, but they had a lot of comment on the role of the church within kind of cultural and political debates. I remember my dad was always talking about, my dad who's an evangelical in the best sense of that word, would always talk about why he felt like James Dobson was going crazy because of some statements that he would make about, about how Christians must vote this way, and how these kinds of like overtly what we would call Christian nationalist statements right now. And so I grew up always just fascinated with evangelical culture, especially as it related to issues of race and family. And so I think coming into a graduate program in sociology, and coming out of a seminary, coming into a graduate program in sociology, I was really interested in the interaction between the evangelical subculture and issues of social and cultural power. And so for my dissertation, that led me towards understanding how evangelical inclinations and stories and narratives and identity led them to participate in the what they considered to be the sacrificial and costly adoption of orphans and engaging in foster care. And subsequently, I became fascinated with how evangelicals are dealing with technological developments and cultural pressures, and that resulted in their own kind of battles with pornography. Evangelicals, it is fascinating to me, evangelicals hate pornography more than almost any other sin. It is. I can't tell you how many books I've read where evangelical leaders, pastors, authors call pornography the cancer that is killing the church, or the greatest sin in the history of the church. And yet, when you look at survey data, evangelicals only look at porn slightly less often than other Americans. And so I reason that surely that must be a problem that they confront, of this incongruence between the fact that they hate pornography so much, but they often find themselves doing it quite often. And so I wanted to write about that phenomenon. And then within the last few years, the advent of, I think, Donald Trump's presidency and his use his courting of evangelicals and his use of Christian nationalist rhetoric, combined with Islamophobia, combined with his ethno-nationalism, combined with his authoritarian populist impulses, have led to, I think, a massive conversation nationally, but also a massive data collection effort where we're trying to understand and wrap our minds around. Is Trump an exemplar of some broader trends that we see within the culture of American Christianity? We think he is, but I think, I said I was going to give a short answer. That ended up being a long answer, is that we often study things that are relevant to us personally, and that led me into this fascination with white evangelical culture and its intersection with family, sexuality, race, and politics. Yep.
So I'm really intrigued with your work as a sociologist. I mean, you talk in your first book about having a certain street cred in terms of your own background, but there's also a kind of way in which you question whether or not you take certain things for granted. And I'm just curious, what is that like for you in terms of having these extensive conversations with evangelicals, like some of the challenges, some of the blind spots, and what advantage might it have given your own personal biography?
Yeah. I think there's a sense in which, having occupied dual spaces, there are not a lot of evangelicals in the academy, and certainly not in sociology. I did a survey recently of academic sociologists, and I asked questions about religion. This is well over 500 sociologists, academic sociologists around the country. And I asked them religion questions, demographic questions, and those kinds of things. And I think 1.5% said that they were evangelical. Less than 20% said that they were any kind of Christian, and most of those were like liberal Protestants, some Catholics. And so I think occupying a professional space, and really a cultural space, I mean, most of my interlocutors and my best friends are sociologists. I think occupying a professional and personal space where there are not a lot of evangelicals, and I think evangelical subculture is kind of weird to most of them, while at the same time growing up in that space, and still is very much a part of my life. A lot of my friends, a lot of my relationships, my family is still in that white evangelical space, and in many ways I'm still connected to that. I think that gives me a sense in which I am often going back and forth between two groups that don't understand one another very well, and trying to look past the biases one group has about the other group, and the misunderstanding. It complicates the narrative of both, right? Like I know academics who do not fit the academic stereotype that evangelicals have, and so many evangelicals who do not fit the stereotype that many evangelicals have of that group. And so I think that benefits me from being, that allows me to look at evangelicals in a way that humanizes them, that understands them not as kind of backwards or cultural dupes, or people who are just pawns in some kind of a political game, even though I think they do fall into that at times. But also in a way that I think is sympathetic to a lot of the things that they acknowledge that they really do feel. They feel persecuted, that they feel targeted, that they feel they are running out of options in terms of having their own influence. They feel like they're always painted as the bad guys for just, in many ways, what they feel like is voting their values. Now, that is not to let them off the hook for a lot of explicitly racist and homophobic and transphobic and a variety of other noxious ideologies that they happen to internalize in many ways unwittingly. But at the very least, I think coming from that subculture allows me to look at them, I think, as an insider, knowing what they feel and where they may be coming from there.
One of the things I'm intrigued by in terms of your more recent scholarship is your argument that the category of evangelical is changing, that it's becoming less a theological category, but a source of political and social identity.
Right.
And I'd be curious to hear more about that. Like, what's going on there when individuals who are not, in some instances, religious, as you suggest,
Right.
that they respond to the category of being an evangelical partly because they think of it in terms of a political source of identity, or in some instances that it indicates that they are a member of the Republican Party, maybe.
Right. So we are actually witnessing this very transition in survey data. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. So within the last, between Trump's presidency in 2016 and 2020, Pew Research Center, they did an analysis of large-scale survey data where they were interested in whether more or less white Americans were subscribing to that identity. We're saying on surveys that they would consider themselves evangelical or born-again Christians. Now, like most people, I probably would be like most in this room, that after Trump, surely I expected that people will be running from that label, evangelical, like it was radioactive, right? Like that surely nobody would want to identify. Well, Pew Research Center found that a higher percentage of white Americans actually called themselves evangelicals before than later, right? And that's pretty shocking considering that like the number of people that consider themselves even Christian has been declining pretty quickly, but more white Americans were calling themselves evangelical in 2020 than they were in 2016. What was going on? Well, Greg Smith, who works at Pew Research Center, he's a pretty savvy political scientist trained as a data analyst. He looked at who it was that was calling themselves evangelical that hadn't done that before. And they found that it wasn't people who were going to church more, it wasn't people who had some kind of religious experience, it was just Trump supporters. It was people who previously had supported Trump, but now were just calling themselves evangelicals, indicating, and this was like a 16% increase. And so like what he showed essentially was that the term evangelical was being emptied of any kind of theological or religious import or implications, but it just meant white, pro-Christian, traditional culture Trump supporter. That is, I think, indicative of a shift that we are seeing, not just in the United States, but even around the world. And I call it the Europeanization of Christian nationalism. So for example, in Europe, they've had a long sense in which, or a long history of people not necessarily going to church, people not necessarily feeling religious or praying a lot or identifying with religion as an important thing, but they still consider themselves Christian, and they still hold Christianity to be an indicator of your really belonging in our country, right? Like our country is a Christian nation. Now they don't mean that because they're very religious, but they mean that because it's an ethno-cultural and political category. It means not Muslim. It means I'm born here. It means the right kind of people. And I think there's a sense in which our religious labels are being emptied of any kind of religious or even theological content, and they're just taking on markers of ethno-cultural and political identity. And I think that's what we found with the Pew data. I think my guess is that will tend to happen more and more. It's actually happened in I think the best example of this is what's happened in former communist countries. Pew, again, I think has put out some really remarkable data. This is a published report that they did. They showed that countries like Ukraine and Bulgaria and Russia actually had an increase in the number of people that called themselves Orthodox Christians, a tremendous increase. It's gone up a lot in the past 20 years. But if you look at, say, church attendance and prayer frequency, it's nobody. Nobody's participating in that kind of thing. Those same people who have increasingly said, I am Christian, I am Orthodox, are the same kind of people that believe Orthodoxy is central to like Russian identity or Bulgarian identity or Ukrainian identity. So it is not about the religious content, it's about the religious label as a marker of ethnoculture, nationalist culture. And I think there's a sense in which the evangelical label is taking on that kind of implication. Not as fast as we've seen it in say like Russia, but I think it's trending that way.
Does that also mean then there's a certain pride attached to the label, that people are proud to identify themselves that way compared to, I don't know, say 5 or 10 years ago, where a person might have been a little bit more hesitant because the concern was that evangelical is stigmatized in the broader culture?
Right. I think you have because the term itself has become polarized because of what it means and implies politically and culturally. I think you have people abandoning that space. I'll talk about that in a moment, but you also have people embracing that space because of what it means. It means I am conservative, traditional, Republican, and that kind of thing. But one of the fascinating developments over the last few years is, especially among young Americans who have any kind of left-leaning or democratic affiliation, as young people often do, they are seeing what the term evangelical, even Christian, implies now. And they're saying it is the connection with right-wing politics that is actually leading a lot of young people to disaffiliate. We can see this in experimental data. We can actually see this in longitudinal data that follows people over time, that young people, when it becomes clear that this is what Christianity implies, that it means right-wing politics, it means traditionalism, it means anti-LGBT, it means anti-wokeness and anti-CRT and all of the things that implies, then they say no thanks and they disaffiliate, even if they go to church still and even if they pray still and even if they might have any kind of theological commitments, they are avoiding that label. So I think the term itself has become polarized to where people either disaffiliate because of it or people run to it because of what that signifies, like the kind of people that you support.
Really interesting. So I want to turn to something that's very much a part of your recent scholarship, and I want to give credit to your co-authors, Andrew Whitehead and Philip Gorski. So you make a number of sort of qualifiers, like I'm writing about contemporary Christian white nationalism, which white nationalism, of course, has been so much in the news since the insurrection at the Capitol. I'd be curious to hear more in terms of like, how do you define Christian white nationalism and how significant has that become for your own research in light of just so many conversations about white nationalism in our current context?
Yeah. So one of the things that we're, I think the most proud of is after the 2016 election, and I can point to headline after headline after headline. November 9th, right after Trump wins, all of the headlines are 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. How could this be? Some variant on 81%, 4 out of 5 white evangelicals, and that was the narrative, white evangelicals. And one of the things I think we have done successfully by I think talking about Christian nationalism is to remove the focus from this one group of Americans, this subculture of white evangelicals who are just a part of this kind of broader trend, and to put the focus on the ideology that actually drove these white evangelicals to vote for Trump in such large numbers. Because we actually see white Christian nationalism among white Catholics and white mainline Protestants and white evangelicals and a lot of other groups who also voted for Trump. And so it works across those. We have tried to disentangle this one subculture that happens to be pretty prominently represented among Christian nationalist ideology. White evangelicals are. The Venn diagram is not a perfect circle, but it's pretty close, right? And yet it's different enough to where like we should actually talk about kind of the underlying ideology or motivation. So white Christian nationalism, as we understand it, so Christian nationalism, I'll say broadly, is an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a very particular kind of Christianity. And when I say Christianity, I always want to put an asterisk by that, or in quotation marks, because I don't mean somebody who has made Jesus the Lord and Savior of their lives, and I don't mean somebody who wants to be Christ-like or follow Jesus in discipleship. I mean Christian as an ethnoculture. So it is an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a white Christian ethnoculture. The reason we called it white Christian nationalism, and this is important, we always try to emphasize this, we didn't do this enough, frankly, in Taking America Back for God. We didn't necessarily have the data to do this or to elaborate on it. And I think it can be confusing for folks at times, and so in the Flag and the Cross, we tried to make a point of emphasizing this. On surveys, when we look at how Americans who affirm Christian nationalist ideology, we ask all these questions about Christian nationalism. And when we look at how Americans who affirm Christian nationalist ideology respond to various other questions about political ideology, it is clear, it is crystal clear that white Americans mean something completely different than, say, African Americans do when they affirm the exact same questions. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's just say African Americans, black Protestants in particular, and white evangelicals affirm Christian nationalist language or statements with basically the same frequency. So does that make like black Protestants Christian nationalists in that sense? No, not at all. Not in the same sense that it does for white evangelicals. So when we ask Americans whether white Americans are discriminated against, and whether they face discrimination or persecution, as Christian nationalism increases, white evangelicals take off, right? Like it is a linear trend between affirming Christian nationalism and believing that white Americans are persecuted, that they get discriminated against. Black Americans, the more they increase in Christian nationalism, it does not change their view. They're not more likely to believe that white Americans are persecuted. I'll give you another really important one. This is one that we don't actually talk about in the Flag and the Cross or Taking America Back, but I'm writing a few papers on this idea. Polarization. So what we call affective polarization and negative polarization is a huge problem. And you can get at this by basically, we measure this in political science and sociology by looking at how much you prefer your own party and how much you don't like the other party. And you can construct a measure, and basically the higher you score on affective polarization is the more you like your own party, the more you dislike your own. So when we ask that same question, we ask Americans, the Christian, we look at them across the Christian nationalism measure. We find that the more white Americans affirm Christian nationalism, they're extremely polarized. They're more likely to love Republicans and detest Democrats, right? But what happens when we ask black Americans that same affective polarization measure? Flat. Christian nationalism does not make them dislike one party more than another. It doesn't engage them in politics the way it does for white Americans. Because for white Americans, Christian nationalist language, the idea of Christian heritage, Christian values, Christian nation, means our country, means our way of life, people like us. It is evocative of a time that they felt like the right people were in charge, our kind of people, that we held political power, that we held sway. Black Americans, when they affirm Christian nationalist language, do not hearken back to a time where the right people were in power or their cultural values were holding sway. If anything, we find that black Americans who affirm Christian nationalist language are, in fact, in some ways, more likely to affirm things that we would associate with civil religion, the idea of tolerance, the idea of justice and equity. We find that black Americans who affirm Christian nationalist language are more likely to affirm a belief in structural racism, that it's systemic. And so it's those kinds of like findings that we see over and over and over again in the quantitative data that lead us to really want to stress this isn't about white evangelicals, because we see it across a variety of religious traditions. And it's not about just Christian nationalism in this generic sense, but it's about white Christian nationalism. It is about white Americans who believe Christian is a stand-in for people like us, and that the country should belong to people like us.
Another distinction you make is religious commitment or personal religion, where you're talking about prayer, Bible study, church attendance, and so on. And what I found interesting is when you make an argument about the comparison of that and white Christian nationalism, there is a link between traditional views on gender, sexuality, and family, and so on. But you argue that there's not quite the same link when it comes to demonization of immigrants, anti-blackness, and so on. And I'm just curious to hear more about that in terms of the relationship between personal religiosity and Christian nationalism.
Yeah. So one of the consistent findings, and we keep on finding this in a variety of different studies, is once we account, and I'm using statistical language here, and I'll try my best to kind of like, for those of you who aren't statisticians or don't have quantitative training, what we're trying to do in our analyses is we're trying to see how Christian nationalism is associated statistically and how it is predictive of various kinds of political outcomes and behaviors. And oftentimes in our multivariate models, when we're trying to build these statistical models to see how predictive Christian nationalism is, we control for a bunch of other factors, like demographic factors like age, region of the country, education, income. We control for religious characteristics, like how often somebody goes to church or prays. And we also control for things like political ideology or partisanship. So one of the things that we consistently find, and we talk about this in Taking America Back for God a lot, is that once we account for Christian nationalism, once we include that in our model, something interesting happens. What we find is that the more religious somebody is, the more often they go to church, pray, read their sacred text, we often find that Christian nationalism and religious commitment behave in completely opposite ways in terms of what they predict. So for example, and Curtis just brought this up, we find that the more somebody affirms Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to hold xenophobic views, fearful of immigrants, wanting to build a border wall, or those kinds of things. But we find that once we account for Christian nationalism, the more religious somebody is, the more often they go to church, pray, the less likely they are to want to build a border wall or to have xenophobic attitudes or Islamophobic attitudes, or even be fearful of atheists. We find that they do not, religious commitment does not cause people to circle the cultural wagons the way that Christian nationalist ideology does. We find this across a variety. Another important one is like guns. So we find the more somebody affirms Christian nationalist ideology, the more likely they are to believe that the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, or that they completely reject the idea of the federal government enforcing stricter gun laws, which are common sense gun legislation, that kind of thing. But once we account for Christian nationalism, we actually find that the more religious people are, the more likely the more in favor they are of common sense gun legislation, the more they disagree with statements like the best way to stop bad guys with guns is good guys with guns. So what does that mean? It means that oftentimes we find this unfortunate association between how religious somebody is and they're holding what we would consider reactionary or authoritarian views. I think what we're finding is that often what's masked in that connection is the Christian nationalism. Once we actually remove statistically the Christian nationalist impulse, the idea that like I'm culturally fearful, the nation belongs to me, I want to take it back. Once we remove that from the analysis, being more religious might just make you a better neighbor. Right? Like it might make you the kind of person that people want to live by, right? Like somebody who is not intolerant, xenophobic, a reactionary kind of like MAGA patriot who feels like this is my country and I want to take it back. Now, it may in some ways, and Curtis made a point that in the book, we talk about this in Taking America Back, we find that regarding LGBTQ issues, religiosity still behaves in the exact same way as Christian nationalism does. It still is associated with intolerance toward gays and lesbians and trans persons. That seems to suggest to us that maybe ideas about human sexuality are related to American religiosity in ways that are a little bit more fundamental than our ideas about, say, like ethnic intolerance. And that's problematic in a variety of different ways. But for some reason, authoritarianism and ethnic intolerance does not behave the way, with religious commitment, the way it does for Christian nationalism. And that is something that we have repeatedly found in study after study after study, which is a really fascinating finding.
One of the interesting things I found, especially, which seems in some ways a kind of a paradox, though with regard to race, I suppose, maybe not, but the formulation in the book is something to the effect of freedom for me, but not for thee.
Right.
The Christian libertarianism that exists alongside this intense desire to impose order on the others.
Right.
And I'd be curious to hear more about how you explore that in terms of teasing that out, because on the one hand, it's a particular notion of freedom, but on the other hand, it's a desire to impose order upon others, and it seems to me race is a crucial factor there.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think this is Christian nationalism, thinking in terms of like terms that are often, or theories or constructs that are often referenced in social psychology. Christian nationalism is highly correlated with something called a social dominance orientation. So social dominance orientation, if you've ever heard reference to that, is the idea that relationships should be characterized by hierarchies and positions of dominance, and Christian nationalism is very much in the frame of mind that there are winners and there are losers and there are in-groups and out-groups, and we want to be on the side, and we ought to be, divinely speaking, we ought to be on the side of those who are on the top in the in-group, right? Like, and those two things go together. And because, for white Americans in particular, Christian identity, Christian heritage, the idea of Christian heritage and Christian values are so inextricably associated with whiteness and presumptions of white supremacy and white superiority. We find that yes, these things absolutely correspond to issues of white supremacy and hierarchy. Also, not just white supremacy, but also patriarchy. In many ways, and this is something that I want to highlight, patriarchy in the sense that it is compensating for something that white males in particular feel that they lack. I saw a study recently, as a matter of fact, I was a reviewer on a recent study that looked at how Christian nationalism was associated with ideas of violence and how that differed by gender performance or gender expression. And the study showed that the Americans who were most likely to affirm Christian nationalist ideology, and not only Christian nationalism, but also violence and political violence, were males who felt like they embodied more feminine characteristics, that they did not embody more masculine characteristics. And what these authors concluded is that Christian nationalism, the inclination towards violence and authoritarian control, is evoked by white males who feel that they are marginalized in some way, right? Emasculated, that they do not have the kind of dignity that they deserve culturally and in social and gendered kind of relationships. And so I think there are two sides of the same coin. That in Christian nationalism, it is assumed that we deserve freedom and liberty and control to order society as we see fit, and that requires us to control marginalized populations who want to usurp that power from below. And of course, that requires a certain kind of rhetoric and a certain kind of speech. A great book that I would reference that I think Christian nationalism is a good example of, Christian nationalist rhetoric and political discourse, is a book called Let Them Eat Tweets by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, who are political scientists, one at Yale, one at Berkeley. And what they argue is that they argue that conservatives in the United States must always, and always have, wrestled with what Daniel Ziblatt, Harvard political scientist, called the conservative dilemma. And what that is the situation in which, as a conservative, you are constantly and forever representing the elite, and mostly the economic elite, those who have the power and the economic power, the class power. But in the United States, you find yourself in this difficult situation where you also must get votes. And you actually must appeal to enough of the population to where they will actually be willing to vote for you. Well, that creates a conservative dilemma. How do you get past that situation where you want to protect the prestige and control of the elites and people who have always controlled power, but you also have to generate enough populist support to get enough votes, a majority? And they would argue, Hacker and Pearson argue, that they argue for what's called plutocratic populism. That is, the wealthy, those who are at the top of the economic class, must engage in the kind of political behavior where they must get white working class individuals to constantly vote against their own economic interests, and they do that by stoking cultural outrage and fear. And you do that by appealing to in-group and out-group and telling those white working class individuals, aren't you sick of those immigrants? Aren't you sick of those Muslims coming in and making you fearful? Aren't you sick of those people, those leftists and socialists and woke people, changing our culture and transforming what used to be ours and taking it? Wouldn't you like to get that back? And you get them to forget the fact that they are being exploited, that they are voting for policies and politicians that will continue to serve the ultra-rich by getting them to kind of think in terms of culture, right? And so Christian nationalist rhetoric and Christian nationalist ideology is really an example, I think an example of how elites and upper class individuals are able to constantly distract white evangelicals and other white working class Americans with the narrative that the culture is being taken, that we're oppressed, that we're being persecuted, that we're losing America as we know it or our way of life, and we're losing control. And so it is something that becomes extremely motivating when politicians who are savvy in communication are able to kind of use and leverage that rhetoric to stoke that fear. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You and Gorski make much of this concept of the deep story.
Yep.
And part of it as a way of explaining sort of the persuasiveness of white Christian nationalism, but also in that book is a call for an alternative deep story.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be curious to hear, to hear you say more about how you understand a deep story, but secondly, just why do you feel there's a need? I mean, I sense that obviously you talk about the deleterious effects of white Christian nationalism, but it seems to suggest something more fundamental about people being persuaded about a certain vision of the past, or at least a story itself.
Right.
And that this partly at least explains the appeal, even if the contents of the story are obviously problematic. It's also about the future, about like how the nation ought to be. So I'd just be curious to hear more about like how you think about deep story and what you have in mind when you talk about offering an alternative narrative.
Yeah. So and that's I'm so glad you brought that up, because this is something I don't have enough opportunity to talk about with a historian like yourself. And so like I think one of the things that historians contribute to the social sciences that sociologists are often remiss and we ignore and overlook. And historians are right, absolutely right, to nail us on it when we engage in this kind of thing, is oftentimes we are so confident in these kinds of overarching theories that we develop post hoc, right? Like we're looking at this kind of like data now, we're kind of developing a theory of like how things develop that way, that we completely ignore contingency. And we had these kind of just so stories that we say, of course, it should have always, of course it turned out this way because our theory explains all of these data that we just happen to have. And I think historians are right to nail us on that because they see contingency and they acknowledge that this is not just kind of this inexorable march to this eventuality. This had to turn out this way. One of the things that we try to do, acknowledge in the Flag and the Cross, and Phil was so good about making sure that we emphasize this, is acknowledging that it didn't have to turn out this way, but decisions were made, right? Like that, instead of a multicultural America that was built on, say, religious freedom and the Roger Williams kind of conception of what America could have been that allowed early on this idea of religious toleration and religious freedom in politics. We decided to go a different way. At the American Revolution, rather than making the tough choice to say that we would not be a nation built, founded on institutionalizing slavery and just turning a blind eye to that and not allowing that, we made another decision. We went a different way, and we compromised in that way. And so we wanted to acknowledge throughout the book that this is not a story of some kind of inexorable march toward what we ended up being, but there was decisions that have been made along the way to merge national, ethnic, and religious identity, resulting in the kinds of things that we see today. That white Christian nationalism has this long story, but it's also the story of decisions that were made. Now, when we look at white Christian nationalism and the deep story that represents, I would argue, sociologically, we have this kind of concept of epistemologies of ignorance. So this is something that sociologists are now talking about in kind of with regard to racial theory. There's an epistemology of ignorance, and an epistemology, a way of seeing the world that consistently allows white Americans to overlook their own complicity in white supremacy, to overlook white supremacy at all, right? To completely ignore that has been a part of our history and a part of our current moment. I believe, and I would argue that white Christian nationalism serves as an epistemology of ignorance in its capacity as a deep story, right? Like that the nation has been good, founded on biblical principles, that we have this noble past that is characterized by good Christian men who have fought for justice and have stood up for freedom and liberty and all of the things that we value, that it made us the great nation that we are today. And if we were to somehow deviate from that, we would cease to be a great nation. We would be something else. We would become what we don't like in Europe. We would become kind of some totalitarian communist state. The deep story of white Christian nationalism allows us to overlook racial injustice in the past by saying, surely racism was not this great part of our history like the left wants to think it is, like the 1619 Project wants us to think it was, that it wasn't characterizing our character as or that it wasn't characterizing us as a nation, that it isn't institutionalized and baked into all of our systems and laws and policies, and every substantial political decision we've ever made is steeped in like white supremacist interests. So I think the deep story allows us to kind of maintain that epistemology of ignorance in the past and in the present, and in a way that preserves white interests today.
And at the end of that, you sort of make a plea for liberal and secular progressives to make an alliance, as it were, with religious people as a way of trying to address some of the problems of white Christian nationalism. I mean, I'm just curious to hear more on that point. I mean, it seems to me this is partly what you're suggesting in terms of an alliance to propose a more accurate story or a deep story.
Right. Yeah, so I think towards the end of The Flag and the Cross, I mean, if you ever get a chance to read The Flag and the Cross, read Taking America Back for God First and The Flag and the Cross. The Flag and the Cross was written post January 6th, and it has definitely got an Empire Strikes Back vibe it is not a feel-good book, right? Like we don't spend much of the book talking about kind of like positive steps forward or hope for the future. I mean, we're very much kind of doom and gloom throughout most of the book, and we wanted to end on something that we felt like was a positive, a constructive encouragement to what needs to happen in the future to make sure that this kind of authoritarian, populist, ethno-traditionalist movement did not gain more power than it already has. And so what we advocate for is and hopefully we don't come across this way. I mean, we're not advocating for, say, progressives who want to stand against Christian nationalism to compromise in areas with people that they feel like are fundamentally at odds with everything that they are and stand for. But we wanted to acknowledge that white Christian nationalism is such a threat. It is such a problem that it requires a willingness to bracket a lot of the disagreements that we have in order to unite forces against what we feel like is this greater threat. So I think an example of this, and we use this earlier on in the book, and I would should have referenced it at the end. Jonathan Haidt, who is a famous author of The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, which was such a prescient book. He wrote that and published it in 2012. And the idea of polarization and what we see now and effective polarization is so obvious, it just seems like it's even more relevant now. But subsequently to that book, he did a YouTube video, he did a TED Talk called The Asteroids Club. And what he argues in that talk is it's premised on the idea that if we all heard that there was an asteroid headed towards Earth, and it was happening in like 5 years from now, we would all, and it was going to kill us all, like we would do the rational thing, which is set aside petty arguments for the sake of uniting and coming together and developing a strategy for overcoming this asteroid that was headed to kill us all. And it turns out he was far too sanguine in that analysis, like because COVID was that asteroid and it damn near killed us all, right? Like it was. COVID ended up being that asteroid that really should have united us, and it just polarized us further. And a lot of that should be hung around Trump's neck, and that is very much a consequence of his rhetoric and the way he decided to handle that situation. But we would argue that white Christian nationalism is one of those asteroids as well. And so one of the things we wanted to argue in the book is that if we really do believe that this is as grave a threat, that kind of rhetoric, that kind of ideology, that kind of perspective, is something that could realistically be used to divide us enough to where authoritarian autocrats end up basically capturing the judiciary, changing the rules of the game in Ziblatt, Levitsky and Ziblatt's kind of terms, how democracies die. They talk about like how democracies end up captured by authoritarian leaders. If we really do believe that it's that much of a threat, we wanted to argue that like it's going to take some coalition building. It's going to take some compromise. Hopefully not on core values, but it's going to take some compromise in some areas so that we can overcome this. And the good news is that may have indeed happened in the 2020 midterms to some degree. We actually saw Christian nationalism had a mixed result in that election, right? Like you saw people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert. Lauren Boebert by the skin of her teeth win an election. Marjorie Taylor Greene in a highly gerrymandered district was able to win out, but some others didn't, right? Like election deniers and Christian nationalists didn't have the best election cycle, and that may have been a reaction to the kind of threat that people were recognizing, and so hopefully we see more of that in the future. Hopefully politicians recognize that is not a winning strategy. I have my doubts as DeSantis ramps up his game, and you see, I don't know if you have recently seen within the last few months his kind of marketing campaign, the commercial that he did about God needed a warrior. This kind of, and it is very evocative of this kind of like strong man, like God needed a tough guy to like come in and take control, and that is definitely the way he's handled his governorship in Florida. And so I think we may have to do the same kind of rally and coalition building to overcome that kind of agenda.
This might be a good point to kind of open the conversation up for some questions from the audience.
Okay, great.
Thanks,
These have all
Sam.
been awesome questions.
Thank
so
you.
Thank you. Yes, let's use that.
Right. Wants to open us up.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I'm Father Mark Kurowski. I'm an independent Catholic priest, not Roman. I have 5 children, some in their 30s.
Okay.
Yeah, and as I listen to you talk, I am struck by the fact that many of these, I have been fighting in terms of race relations my entire vocation, 40 years, and have been trying to build bridges and relationships. This coalition building that you're talking about,
Right.
how does it get over the, because here I am at the University of Chicago, very uncomfortably thinking to myself, I sat at the dinner table when my children came home from college being told that I was the scourge of the earth because I was a white, male, heterosexual Christian man.
Okay.
And I had dedicated my life to these causes,
Right.
to open doors, to stand back, to do these things. I'm struck by a story that was told by David Foster Wallace in a commencement address, What is Water? Two young fish swimming along, and an older fish comes by and he goes, hey boys, how's the water today? And they look at each other and go, what is water? And how do we cross this divide? Because I feel there is a disconnect, that those who are secular humanists don't pay attention. I believe that they don't pay attention to the water that they're in,
Sure.
about people like me,
Right.
who very much, by the way, the more religious I become, the more older I get, and the more I read the scriptures, the more I realize that it's about love and it's about generosity and kindness, and I fall into that category of the people that are. So my question is, how do we cross? My first question is, how do we cross that divide,
Right.
to get each other to swim in the same water?
Right.
That's the first question. The second question I have is, I think you answered it, is that Lewis Powell wrote the Attack on the Free Enterprise System, a memorandum to the Chamber of Commerce that laid out an attack for those in business to push back on the liberalization of America. And I'm wondering how much the fact that incomes have stayed stagnant since the 1980s has contributed to the growth of white Christian nationalism.
Right. So let me answer your first question. I think economic insecurity and class insecurity. If you ever read Arlie Hochschild's book "Strangers in Their Own Lands," I mean, she interviews all of these like oil field workers in Louisiana and Texas, and this is just brilliant and well written. I mean, a really famous analysis of these marginalized white working class individuals who feel like they have no dignity, right? Like that the economic situation has marginalized them to where they can't fulfill their role as like a man, a provider, that is difficult for them. And meanwhile, they actually see through, say, affirmative action or what they see in politics, they see people cutting in. It's like they're all standing in line. That's the metaphor. They're all standing in line waiting to get the American dream, their piece of this. And they see people cutting in front of them. and that is their interpretation of like, I've been working hard. I got nothing, right? Like I don't have any dignity. I've tried to do this the right way, and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton are allowing people to just cut in line, right? Like they're and they feel outraged by this. And I think that is the kind of rhetoric and understanding that Republicans on the right have been able to kind of leverage to say, don't you feel taken advantage of? Don't you feel like this country rightfully belongs to you? And in that book, the men repeatedly say the things that do give them dignity are their masculinity and their Christianity, and I feel like that is this kind of social dislocation as a result of economic tensions, polarization, and insecurity creates a context in which white Christian nationalism can take root because of that class inequality, in combination with partisan rhetoric, right? Like in combination with that kind of rhetoric that's telling them, no, you ought to be mad, and here's who you ought to be mad at. Not at the fat cat business people who are getting all the tax breaks, but it should be all of those immigrants and foreigners and Muslims and Colin Kaepernick, right? Like for taking what's yours. To answer your first question, that is the perennial problem. Democrats are notoriously ineffective in office, largely because the Democratic Party has never been a unified party on issues of race, religion, even political identity or ideological identity, whereas Republicans have increasingly unified around a religious identity, an ideological identity, conservative, and increasingly the party of the white group, even though like Hispanic men have increasingly kind of identified as Republican in recent years. So Republican politicians are able to speak to that unity in a way that they are comfortably say they're all speaking to the same crowd, who all kind of know the same thing. Whereas as a Democratic Party leader, somebody who's trying to build coalitions and trying to unite a group to say, we want to stand up for these kinds of things, they are speaking to seculars and black Protestants who are socially conservative but economically progressive, and they're speaking to white mainline Protestants who are a mixed bag, and they're speaking to ethnic immigrants, and they're speaking to Jewish Americans, and so they have to, and unsuccessfully oftentimes, develop this kind of broader narrative. And this is something that social scientists, I think, social scientists have pointed out, that the right has this really compelling story. They benefit from this story of kind of like marginalization and or not disenfranchisement, but marginalization and loss is their story. But the left has no similar story that unites them all, right? Other than maybe the threat of democracy, like democracy being toppled, maybe the threat of authoritarianism. That seems to have worked in the 2020 midterms, right? Like a reaction to Roe being overturned, a reaction to conspiracy theories about the election, a reaction to Christian nationalism. Maybe authoritarianism has worked, but there is still all of this kind of infighting that takes place among, say, liberals and further left people about who is to blame, and it's really unproductive. And so I share that I share that frustration with a failure to recognize who is the real opponent here. Okay.
Thank you for being here tonight. Hi, my name is Charlotte. I have thought about the term Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism as something that is both in the water and like old. Yeah, and I know that you and Professor Whitehead didn't make it up, but it does seem to have sort of galvanized and created a cohesive idea, maybe. Yeah. And I wonder how you think about, together with your colleagues, the sort of long game of what it means to name something like that and give it a title that then is can be owned by by Christian nationalists, and has been, can be identified in academic spaces for better or worse, right? Being like, oh, that's that thing that I've read about in a book that was published, or as something to fight against, right? If there's like positives and negatives to that, and I know that it's not always the academic's job to think in terms of centuries, but I hope that we do. So.
Sure, such a great question. And the answer is, it keeps me up at night, knowing that there have been books published in the last couple of years arguing for Christian nationalism by name, and the authors of those books credit people like us for drawing attention to that, and them saying, yes, I read your book about blasting Christian nationalism, and we realized, yes, we are Christians and we are nationalists. We are Christian nationalists, and here's a book arguing for why Christians ought to embrace the term. And so like really speaking to us. And so like Marjorie Taylor Greene, like the most attention that came to Christian nationalism came from her reading discourse about Christian nationalism, about how it was so bad, and her saying, no, it's actually good. We ought to be the party of Christian nationalists. And now people like actually saying that that's actually a thing, right? Like that's something that they want to embrace and internalize. And so having to deal with, having to think about, we talked about this thing, we identified it, we worked really hard to like write op-eds to get this into the public view. And now people on the right are actually taking that and saying, yes, I like that idea. Thank you for bringing that up. And that is what we are, in fact, and we will do that. You know, on the one hand, it causes me to want to be very careful about defining our terms, because I don't want Christian nationalism to be the left's version of woke or CRT, right? Like, I don't want it to be a slur that is indiscriminately used against all Christians just trying to vote their values. That's not fair, and that's what we've never tried to do. Like we've always said, we're not talking about Christians voting their values. We're not talking about people who just want to, live out their faith in public. We're not trying to suppress conservative Christians from voting, as we were accused of doing by the Family Research Council. We're not trying to do that. So we want to be very careful about defining our terms. But on the other hand, right, because far-right reactionaries want to say, yeah, we're calling ourselves Christian nationalists now, and that's a thing. I don't want to shrink from that just because, what if I wrote a book about white supremacy, and it made white supremacists say, well, now that you say it, I'm gonna be a white supremacist even harder, right? Like I'm gonna double down on white supremacy because you called it out, right? Like I'm gonna say, okay, great, I will fight you on that, turf as well because it's just wrong, right? Like it's anti-democratic, it's unconstitutional. As a Christian myself, I happen to think it's unchristian, right? Like, and as I understand normatively what that means to me. So, I absolutely think it's something that gives me pause, knowing that people are now racing with this, and it's actually worse than you know. So it has become a popular term that publishers are now just slapping it on everything to sell books. I actually have several examples of people who have written books on, say, like religion and politics, and the publisher being like, yeah, we're going to call it Christian nationalism in the subtitle. Like they don't even talk about Christian nationalism in the book, but they're just going to call it that now. Like books that have been written, books that were written in 2018, 2019 about white evangelicals and Trump or religion and Trump or that kind of thing are now being changed to include Christian nationalism in the subtitle. A book who's one of them who's co-authors, it's called The Everyday Crusade, Christian Nationalism in American Politics. Not even about Christian nationalism. It's about something they call American religious exceptionalism. But the publisher told them, if we're going to sell this book, we're going to call it Christian nationalism. And so it has become a thing where it's like, my dad worked for Procter & Gamble, and he said that there was and they make Febreze. And my dad told me one time that there was a period there was a period in sales where basically they were just slapping every Febreze on everything. Now with Febreze, right? Like it's just, it became a way where they sold it because it was such a popular item. And now it is that with books, like Christian nationalism is this year's Febreze, now with Febreze, now with Christian nationalism. And so I believe that is a problematic thing, which makes me as a scholar really want to say, look, this is exactly what we're talking about, not that. And yet at the same time, I can't be scared that reactionaries use the label and run with it just because it's, they're going to do that and that's going to happen. Does that make sense? Okay. Hey, did you have a question? Yeah. Sorry, you.
Yeah, just to follow up on this question. So I think I'm less interested, and it was great, your interview was great. I'm less curious about the deep story as I am about a more textured story.
Okay.
So you can question whether there's enough stability to call Christian nationalists, to make a connection, implicit connection between the Christian nationalists of today with, previous generations. And I'm just worried that lumping everything together and then making a comparison, I got a little worried when you said, oh, the Europeanization of, I can't see any coherence in the European story, frankly. I'm Dutch originally, and I know, in fact, I spoke to the MDiv program earlier this week saying that indeed in the Netherlands there are people calling themselves Christian, and it's really masking an anti-immigrant position.
Right.
But most of those countries have official Christian parties.
Yes.
The Dutch do, the Germans do, and the AfD came from the CDU, CSU, but they're not really in competition. So I don't see any coherent story there, really. And it just worries me a little bit because, for instance, you can say Europe has become secular in many ways, but a lot of what was called Christian has gone, say, into the Green parties, which are a really major force all across Europe, actually. So I think more textures needed to just say, oh, well, we have Christian nationalists in the US and you have the same in Europe. And talk about Ukraine. I mean, there's a big split in Orthodoxy between Ukrainian Orthodoxy and Russian Orthodoxy, having everything to do with the war and very little with Christianity, in fact.
Right.
So I think I'm a little worried about lumping things on the one hand.
Sure.
And on the other hand, I would be in favor of lumping more things. No, because what Netanyahu is doing in Israel is a kind of religious nationalism that is very similar to white Christian nationalism in the US, right? We don't call it that. And the same with Modi in India.
Yes, exactly.
So they're a global phenomenon where I think you actually need to make the comparison.
Yes.
And more textured view, I would say, for Europe and the US, where I wouldn't lump everything together as Christian nationalism.
Right, so forgive me if I was so clumsy to communicate my point that I gave that impression. I actually am in agreement with you completely that I'm not trying to apply kind of our little rubric of Christian nationalism to other places and saying that's Christian nationalism like here. I actually think white Christian nationalism in the United States is one instantiation of a global phenomenon of just the rise of what you might call authoritarian ethno-traditionalism. And I think that Christian nationalism is here just an instance of and it's an American style because of our own unique history with race and religion and politics, our own structure, that you don't necessarily get in other places, but you get a version of authoritarian ethno-traditionalism in other places, like Brazil and Hungary and Israel and India and Russia and all these other places. And so, and you get different religious expressions and flavors of that with different actors and different characters, different enemies, different bad guys that they're trying to. But usually they have a lot of continuity as well. Like it's usually very anti-immigrant. It's usually very pro-patriarchal family and a return to those kinds of traditional values. Pro-fertility for that reason, like keeping women in the home. And anti-media, like questioning kind of like the free press and authoritarian and that kind of get tough kind of idea. And very nationalist. And so I'm in complete agreement that I think that is more in line with what I was talking about there. So great point.
Hi, thanks for your talk. My name's Kate, and I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about and if there is, and if so, what it is, the gendered nuance within Christian nationalism.
Yes. Yeah. So
I'll just go with that.
So Christian nationalism we have found to be so very strongly associated with patriarchal views. And I think that is a part of this kind of like broader story of like authoritarian ethno-traditionalism, wanting to go back to an earlier time where the right people were in charge, and that just doesn't mean just Christians and white people, it also means men. Martin Marty, who worked at the Divinity School here, and his book Piety and Passion argues that religious fundamentalism is very much a response to perceptions that like patriarchy is being toppled and that needs to be corrected. And I think that is an example of that. And so with Christian nationalism, we published a study just within the past few months showing that Christian nationalist ideology is strongly correlated with concerns about declining American fertility and the need for couples to have more babies, and that need to being an important part of our culture. But we found that it is among white Americans, right? Like it is a white Christian nationalist story that, hey, we need to be worried about as a nation, that we need to have more babies, that this is something that like fertility decline, demographic winter, and all these kinds of things. And what goes along with this is this story that, well, how do we make that happen? Well, we need to go back to traditional families, women in the home, men working, and everybody fitting into their role, and us having more babies, this idea. And you can actually find Christian right authors now saying, I think of Kevin DeYoung, who's a very prominent kind of evangelical author, explicitly arguing, like, you know what a great culture war strategy would be that Christians should get behind is having more babies and just discipling them like crazy. They look at they're not idiots, they look at demographic patterns and they realize that secular people have less babies than religious people, and they say, you know what, we ought to lean into that advantage and we ought to outbreed them, right? Like we ought to be able to, like, if we could go back to like 5 kids per lady, and just do that over a couple of generations, we're waiting on people to be born for them to become Christians. They'll all be Christians, and so the patriarchy story is inextricably linked with white Christian nationalist ideology, if that makes sense. It's something that we didn't include a lot in the book, but it's just definitely a part of that story. Hi.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Guillermo. I had a question regarding if you're seeing connection or engagement by Latinos and whiteness with Christian nationalism, because I'm asking this because of two things. Like, from Latin America, we're seeing that there was a movement called Latinos for Trump,
Right.
and then we found out that they were evangelical, but when they were being interviewed, they didn't want to be called Latinos. They wanted to be called Hispanics because it seems that they would prefer not to be connected with Latin America, more connected with Europe.
Interesting.
And another fact that we saw is also that there is now field work occurring in Boston because there are Brazilians there that are Christians and that they are citizens of Brazil and also citizens of the States.
Right.
And they used to vote only here in general for Republicans, but that changed with Bolsonaro, and then now they are starting to use also their right to vote in Brazil, to vote for Bolsonaro. And when I asked the professor that was doing this, and he mentioned that these Brazilians are mostly white passing Brazilians, and religious Brazilians. So I wanted to ask you if you have seen engagement of Latino communities with Christian nationalism, and where do you think is gonna go? Is this gonna expand the idea of who is white in America, or?
Right. So great questions with several different answers. So if we see engagement of Latino Americans with white Christian nationalism, it will be more likely to be found not among Catholics, but among, say, New Apostolic Reformed or Pentecostal Latinos. Pentecostals, we find on surveys denominationally, are the group that is most likely to affirm Christian nationalist ideology among all groups. That includes Southern Baptists. Pentecostal or holiness traditions are more likely to. And if Latinos are engaging, that's usually Latino Pentecostals. Unfortunately, and I'll say this as somebody whose data is primarily survey analysis these days, I've done a lot of qualitative work, but a lot of the Christian nationalism stuff has been survey analysis. We are constantly beholden to the problem of smaller sample sizes and not a lot of nuanced questions about the ethnic identity of Latinos or Hispanics who fill out these surveys. So, for example, we don't know whether it's Cubans or Puerto Ricans. We don't know whether it is Spanish or Central American or South American. We just don't know. They just identify as Hispanic, right? That is a broad category that masks so much variation in political attitudes. And so what we find is we often find, and this is unsurprising, we find that Latinos and their kind of political attitudes, and as it correlates with Christian nationalism, we find they're usually somewhere in the middle between Black Americans and white Americans. But that's likely masking huge variation. Maybe Puerto Ricans behave exactly like Black Americans with respect to Christian nationalism, and Cubans are exactly like white Americans. Does that make sense? And so we just don't have enough good data with large enough sample sizes and good discussions of, say, ethnic variation or national kind of heritage to be able to draw. And the person who gets that data should write a book immediately on that, because that is a book that I can tell you that nobody has studied that, and it is absolutely necessary. And so as soon as you can get the money to field that huge survey with 50,000 respondents that we would have enough respondents to be able to do, then I will write that book with you, and we will make it happen. I think these are the kinds of things that we are seeing. I think as more Hispanics within the last couple of years have warmed up to Trump and the Republican Party, I think that's another kind of section of research that has not been explored. We only have really two say elections, the midterms and the presidential election, where Hispanics went hard or harder for the Republican Party, and so more data needs to be collected and conclusions need to be drawn, but we just don't have it. Yep.
Go final.
Yeah, good evening. My name's Jack. I had a question for you. You said that white Christian nationalists and Black Christian nationalists hear the same, affirm the same propositions,
Yes.
but mean different things. And I'm curious what those what those propositions are that they have in common.
Right, so in our surveys, we ask a similar battery of questions. We've adjusted the measures somewhat just to more what we call face validity, that just are more precise. But we ask questions: how much you agree or disagree with the following statement. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. The federal government should advocate Christian values. The success of the United States is part of God's plan. That the federal government should advocate should enforce a strict separation of church and state. We look at the people who disagree with that statement. They don't want a separation of church and state. In the flag and the cross, we ask a question about whether you believe the founding documents were divinely inspired, right? So we basically look at how people agree with those statements, and so we find that black Americans and white Americans affirm those questions with basically the same kind of rate, but they just mean something completely different. It's just clear that black Americans it doesn't incline black Americans toward reactionary, authoritarian, ethnocentric politics the way it does for white Americans. Religion is racialized, and there's just there's no way to talk about American religion without acknowledging that for white Americans, those kinds of categories and concepts mean something completely different because of their history and social structure and that kind of thing. Yes?
We're actually going to do 2 more questions.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. I think I have a question of clarification, but I was interested in what you were saying about the connection between religiosity and Christian nationalism.
Yes.
And I'm Professor Evans' student, I'm a historian, and so I statistics kind of scares me, so I'm not really sure, I guess I'm not really sure what you mean when you say you account for Christian nationalism when you're sort of analyzing those trends. And I'm wondering, I think specifically, is there among Christian nationalists, if you isolated them, is there a relationship between religiosity and stronger Christian nationalism? Or does that relationship not exist as well, and religiosity really has very little influence on Christian nationalist beliefs?
Right. So, imagine. So when I talk about taking it into account or holding it constant, imagine a lab, where we're in lab coats and we're statistically doing what is essentially the equivalent of a control group, where we have made some kind of variable constant. So all we're doing with that is we're doing it statistically. So we're allowing the statistics software to hold Christian nationalism constant for the whole group. So that what we're looking at is we're able to isolate the association between religiosity and some kind of political outcome. So that's how we can be confident that we have taken Christian nationalism into account, meaning we have controlled for it, meaning we do the same thing with age, region of the country, education, so that it's no longer a statistical influence we're able to isolate. Does that make sense? Okay. And so that's all I mean, is that we have tried to, once we control for Christian nationalism, we see that religiosity seems to be associated with basically pro-social kind of attitudes, things that we would hope in our neighbors and in politics. Now, that's a good question. Do we see, if we just isolated the Christian nationalists, would we see the same kind of thing? I don't think we do. I think Christian nationalism kind of, those Christian nationalists who are more intense in their religious participation are probably just deeper, darker Christian nationalists. Because that means they're probably more embedded in their own network of religiosity measures. When we're measuring these things on surveys, we're not really measuring how often somebody goes to church, even though we ask that question. We're asking them do you consider yourself the kind of person who goes to church? Who do you associate with? Are you embedded within a network of other people who participate this way? Are you a really, really deeply religious kind of person, and do you consider yourself that? I think Christian nationalists who go to church a lot, pray a lot, read their Bible a lot, are probably just really in deep with the kind of people who also agree with them. Oh, we got another one. Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Professor Perry,
Sure.
both for this conversation and for your larger work. I'm glad you mentioned Martin Riesebrot, who did great work here on fundamentalism. And I bring that up because your mention of sort of global authoritarian ethno-traditionalism sounds similar to what previous generations of scholars would have called and did call fundamentalism.
Right, sure.
Right, so we at the Divinity School were home to the fundamentalism project back in the 80s and 90s. And so I'd like to ask you for your thoughts on, is there and what are the differences or the distinctions between white Christian nationalism and what these earlier scholars would have called fundamentalism? And that's maybe my way of getting at a larger question, which is the sort of what is new here,
Right.
but focusing particularly on that question of fundamentalism. Anyway, any thoughts you
Yep.
have on that would be wonderful.
I think it's a completely fair question to try to tease out what distinguishes what we see now from kind of historic fundamentalism. I think the narrative, and this narrative needs to be complicated, and I don't want to give like clear cut. Like there's this kind of story about like, well, fundamentalists were retreatists and evangelicals. Then they became evangelicals and they became all culturally engaged, right? Like it's more complicated than that, obviously. But when we're thinking like the historical legacy of, say, fundamentalists like Jerry Falwell Sr. before he became really politically active, if we're taking pre-politically active Jerry Falwell Sr. as, say, like a fundamentalist, then that would be the idea. Certainly they would believe the same things, like reactionary to politics, believing that communism was this huge threat, that there's this kind of like cultural watering down of like the Christian message, and they wanted to preserve what was theirs and circle the wagons. I think with white Christian nationalism, you have really a combination of that kind of fundamentalist impulse of hierarchies, power, and rigid authoritarian kind of a sense of control, with this kind of evangelical quest to say everything belongs to God, all the world belongs to us, and we rightfully should conquer, right? Like, and this is in this kind of narrative in the books written by prominent Christian nationalists now, who are actually calling themselves by that name. They argue for dominion. They argue for, and dominionism has a long history. So like, and most of these people wouldn't call themselves dominionists. They would say that's Rushdoony. I mean, Rushdoony has a long history as well. And so I think in some sense you can see white Christian nationalism in some manifestations of that as a carryover from the historic Rushdoony dominionist kind of idea. And yet most of these people are not post-millennial like that. They are not people. They are not people who believe like in the kind of eschatological view that we are supposed to, as Christians, take over the world. Even though like politically that's what they seem to be going after. Most of them are pre-mill folks. Like most of them believe that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and this is part of our kind of like defending what is left of the Christian kind of witness and influence in society. And so I think there's some sense in which like white Christian nationalism is a carryover of the kind of Rushdoony and fundamentalist era. And yet it's something new because it's something that is like, it's more secular, it's more racialized, explicitly racialized. I think there is a greater depth of feeling of persecution on a global scale. But still there's that fear of globalism, that fear of one worldism, as like Bob Jones would have said. You know, so while acknowledging the continuity, I think there are some kind of like circumstances that make it something unique, if that makes sense. Yeah. Hey.
I think we are all out of time. So thank you so much for coming to join us and for such wonderful questions. And please join me as we say goodbye. Thank you to Professor Evans and Professor Perry for this incredible conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.